He's universally recognized as the king of martial arts movies after making only one Hollywood film. He died young, aged just 32, and went on to become the biggest movie star in history. And he influenced popular culture more than anyone, before or since.
Bruce totally inspired me and made me dream and made me realize that I wanted to be a filmmaker.
He definitely inspired me to want to do more with my life.
I know that Bruce Lee is the best.
Bruce Lee changed the world. It resonated not only with Asians, but it resonated with the black community, the white community.
He was a hero for an entire culture that had no heroes.
Bruce Lee is the father of mixed martial arts.
That was a huge elbow that...
Bruce Lee isn't just a fighter, he's a thinker, and the rules that he created in his book and the guidelines, they're transferable to anything in life.
He was smart enough to create this very simple, iconic image that was endlessly reproducible. He's everywhere.
We need emotional content. Don't think, feel. That's it.
Bruce Lee, actor, icon, and skilled martial artist. A man able to perform superhuman feats that have yet to be equaled, such as a two-fingered push-up and a lethal blow called the one-inch punch. As well as a skilled martial artist, Bruce Lee was a writer, philosopher, and filmmaker. He was the first person to use his phenomenal kung fu skills on screen without the aid of special effects.
Bruce Lee totally revolutionized the way unarmed combat would be presented on screen.
But he wouldn't live to see his global impact. He died suddenly in Hong Kong, aged just 32, having starred in only 4 kung fu films. His biggest film, Enter the Dragon, was released on August 19, 1973, 4 weeks after his death. It was an instant hit, creating a superstar whose influence would change the world forever.
Secret chambers of Han's evil empire.
For many people, Enter the Dragon was their first glimpse of this new Asian superstar. The movie left a profound and lasting impression, influencing and inspiring people around the world, like rapper and actor LL Cool J.
From the first time I saw him on screen, you know, I just thought he was electrifying. He had a lot of charisma. He was magnetic, so fluid with his movements and so cat-like. It was just really, really exciting for me. A lot of his speaking he did through movement, through posture, through looks and glances. I mean, there were certain scenes where he didn't even have to say anything.
LL Cool J is the first rap artist to amass 10 consecutive platinum-selling albums. He's moved on to a successful acting career, with more than 30 films under his belt.
Bruce Lee influenced me because Bruce Lee made me want to make movies. He was a powerful human being, and you know, that inner power, I think, resonated. It jumped off the screen and touched you personally.
It's not just actors Bruce Lee has inspired. His influence can be felt in people from all walks of life.
Anybody who came into the martial arts film world, whether they admit it or not, Bruce Lee was a prime influence. More interesting is the way that people in other areas of popular culture, the rappers, the musicians, the filmmakers, directors, cinematographers, they all have been influenced by Bruce Lee.
Hollywood film director Brett Ratner cites Bruce Lee as his biggest influence. He's directed 8 feature films, grossing over $1.5 billion, and is best known for the Rush Hour trilogy, starring Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker.
First Bruce Lee film I saw was Enter the Dragon, and I became obsessed with it. I think I've watched it more than any other movie I've ever watched in my entire life, and it just completely blew me away. He had such a unique persona, and such a unique style, and individuality, that he made fighting entertaining. He made it fun. He made it dramatic. He made it emotional.
Actor Eddie Griffin's first experience of Bruce Lee was watching his second film, Fist of Fury, also known as The Chinese Connection. It was released in 1973, made in Cantonese and dubbed into English.
Why did you kill my teacher?
Man, we were at the drive-in theater, Kansas City, Missouri, right? It's one of those movie theaters where they have 2 screens. There's one over here and there's one here. And we were watching Fist of Fury. And there's a porno playing on the other one. Tell you how good Bruce is. Nobody was watching the porno.
We fight alone or all together?
It'll just take me to show you.
Blown away, man. We came out of the place. Immediately, everybody started emulating Bruce. Throwing kicks at your little brother, you know, at your big brother, you know. And been hooked on that dude ever since.
Fellow comedian and actor Margaret Cho first saw Bruce Lee when she was 8 years old, watching his films with her family.
He was like a beautiful, beautiful man, but also something that was not human. I think his influence for me personally was really huge, and watching him as a child made me see, or gave me the notion that I could do whatever I wanted. I don't know like how I got the idea that I could be a comedian and be in movies and be in TV. I just don't know, but I realized it was because of Bruce Lee. So I feel like I have an eternal debt to him that I've got to fight somehow.
And many did just that, going on to become champions in their own field. Sugar Ray Leonard is widely regarded as one of the best fighters of his generation, earning an unprecedented 6 world championship titles in 5 weight classes.
I've told people all over the world that Bruce Lee was one of my idols, mainly because of his mental stability, because of his fighting spirit, because it was more mental than just physical.
What's more interesting is to meet people whom you would not imagine, like Carlos Santana, who you would not think was a Bruce Lee fanatic. And he came to Hong Kong, the first thing he said was, "Where's the Bruce Lee Memorial? I want to go and pay respect to the spirit of Bruce Lee." So it's all pervasive, and I've encountered it again and again during my work.
Athletes, actors, artists, and musicians all cite Bruce Lee as an influence. So how did a skinny kid called Lee Hsien Loong rise from the back streets of Hong Kong to become the global icon known as Bruce Lee? And why, 35 years after his death, is his popularity and influence stronger than ever?
Water can flow or creep or drip or crash. Be water, my friend.
Bruce Lee's philosophy has sparked an unusual following across European cities. This is free running, the art of expressing yourself physically as you move across urban spaces. Free running is an offshoot of a discipline that first emerged in France, known as parkour. It took Bruce Lee's philosophy of developing instinctive movement and applied it to how a body can move across an urban space as freely and directly as possible.
The ultimate goal with free running is to be fluid and to attain flow. Bruce Lee said that you must move like water to flow, to adapt to any given situation. So You never stop at obstacles, you just keep moving and find a way around them.
Bruce Lee has been a big influence on parkour freerunners because of his philosophy. These arts also have a philosophy. It's not just simple movement. There is actually a method to it, and there is like ways of intercepting the obstacles, ways of calculating, being sensitive to your environment, and ultimately altering your awareness so you become more in tune to yourself and your environment.
It's a philosophy that can be adapted to many disciplines and situations.
Bruce Lee isn't just a fighter, he's a thinker, and the rules that he created in his book and the guidelines, they're transferable to anything in life, and especially anything that involves using your body.
Then the fight is one blow, one kick, until you can put combinations together without even thinking. Until you learn how to keep moving and to endure, you've got to listen.
Bruce Lee's philosophy is absolutely as fresh as when it was newly minted in the 1970s. Adapt what is useful, reject what is useless, and create what is specifically your own, which you can apply to anything. I might do that as a filmmaker, you might do that as a documentary filmmaker, somebody else might do that as a musician, as a sculptor, a dancer, whatever. Everybody can adapt that philosophy to their area of expertise.
Bruce Lee's introduction to philosophy started early, at 13, when he began studying Kung Fu under the guidance of the legendary master, Yip Man. He taught Bruce Lee that the martial arts involve much more than just the physical. When he came to the United States at the age of 18, Bruce Lee majored in philosophy, studying all types, Eastern, Western, ancient, and modern, so that he could blend the physical and the philosophical in his martial art of Jeet Kune Do. He summed up his philosophy of being flexible, fluid, and not sticking to one particular style in a television interview in 1971.
Empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
The Pierre Berton interview was one of the few Bruce Lee did in English, and it allowed him to communicate his thoughts to an audience outside of Hong Kong.
So in this interview, he was able to communicate all those thoughts and do it in such a way that it was not just physical, also philosophical, and a way to conduct one's life. That's why I think this interview is more meaningful than many of the others that concentrate only on Bruce's physical ability.
His philosophies, his work ethic, his cultural kind of background, and to interpolate that into a kind of a cinematic world where it's believable. You have an actor who really believes this way of life. You know, he was the real thing. He compares Kung Fu to water, that Kung Fu has the continuity of movement, where, you know, it's constantly moving. Water, you cannot grab, right? And water can go through a solid, you know, it can go through a rock. It's philosophical, but at the same time, simplistic. And it can be understood by a young child or a master.
Bruce Lee's philosophy, recounted in his book, The Tao of Jeet Kune Do, was apparent in some of his earliest American TV appearances, where he would include his teachings in the script.
You must free your ambitious mind and learn the art of dying.
He quotes from the Hagakure, the Japanese way of the warrior. To learn to lose, to learn to die, is to be liberated from it. I mean, it's just amazing to think of, like, getting that kind of information, that kind of philosophy on a mainstream television show.
Bruce Lee changed philosophy by modernizing it and making it mainstream. He embraced the notion of self-help years before it became popular and showed that philosophy could be part of everyday life.
Bruce Lee had his own philosophy, and that philosophy ultimately was finding yourself, in my opinion, truthfully expressing yourself, and putting on no pretense. Being able to be who you are is a hard thing without putting on a show. So his goal was to just be.
Bruce Lee's philosophy is still being picked up and taught by people around the world. Sifu Shi Yen Ming, is a 34th generation Shaolin monk who defected from China to the US in 1992 and opened up a Shaolin temple in Manhattan. He teaches Chan philosophy, also known as action meditation.
Tell you about Bruce Lee's philosophy. His philosophy was fantastic, just like I'm teaching, the Chan Buddhism, Chan, C-H-A-N, Buddhism, the philosophy, knowledge. Nothing can be everything. Everything can be nothing.
Sifu Shi Yan-ming credits Bruce Lee as being the main influence on his life and believes that he should be recognized as one of the world's great philosophers.
Bruce Lee was authentic martial artist. Also, he was the philosopher. If he wasn't great martial artist, he will be the greatest philosopher, without question.
Now, I read the Bible and the Quran sometimes, and it mentions that there are major prophets and there are minor prophets. The major prophets we all know, Moses, Jesus, Abraham, Muhammad. In my theory, I believe that Bruce Lee was a minor prophet, you know what I mean? Because what he brought to martial art and what he brought to American society, what he brought to the Asian culture in American society to be accepted by all people is something that prophets do.
Bruce Lee's philosophy has been adopted by people in numerous fields. His belief that success flows from dedication and self-knowledge helped propel him to become the first Asian superstar and would change forever the way Asians are seen in the West. Bruce Lee exploded onto American cinema screens in August 1973 in Enter the Dragon. For many Asian Americans, he was a revelation, the first Asian hero they had ever seen on the screen.
Usually you would be seeing white actors playing Asian roles, like Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's.
You disturb me!
So the appearance of Bruce Lee was quite revolutionary because people of the actual race were playing that race. He brought Asian faces to American cinema.
For many Asian people around the world, Bruce Lee became an instant role model.
We connected to him because he was the first one that came out and said, look, I'm Chinese, I have yellow skin, you know, I can do everything else everybody else can. For myself, growing up in America, I can totally relate to him. You know, coming to America as an immigrant, being a minority in a dominant white world, and the things that he wanted to achieve in life. I believe that's why other minority races, they can relate to that, especially the urban minorities. They can feel the same passion that Bruce Lee wanted to bring for his own race.
Before Bruce Lee, the majority of Asian characters in Western films were limited to being evil masterminds like Fu Manchu, subservient laborers, or comic fools.
Bruce Lee really changed the way Asian actors are seen in the West, and I think that's something you can give him a lot of credit for. For Chinese people around the world, and also for minorities around the world living anywhere where they're sort of oppressed, beaten down, have a crummy job. This was huge. This was someone with non-white skin who was not Caucasian. This was someone standing up and sticking up for themselves.
And it wasn't just Asians who connected with this new non-white hero.
He was a hero for an entire culture that had no heroes. Bruce came along in Kato. It was the first time that you've seen an Asian guy in control.
Everything on the table where we can all see it.
As an African American, that was the first time I saw someone who seemed darker to me doing something like that. Like I had never seen that before. It was the first hero that I ever saw that wasn't a white person.
Prior to making his 4 Kung Fu films, Bruce Lee was cast as the crime-fighting chauffeur, Kato, in the 1966 TV series, The Green Hornet.
Protect the rights and lives of decent citizens, rides the Green Hornet.
He got the part after being spotted at a karate tournament in California.
Test X2, take 1, speed.
It was this screen test that was to lead to his first U.S. television role.
My last name is Lee, Bruce Lee.
Speed.
It was also Bruce Lee's first chance to demonstrate his formidable kung fu skills on screen.
Straight at the groin, or come up. Or, if I can back up a little bit, you start back from here, and then come back. All right. You're kind of worried.
While playing Kato, Bruce Lee experienced at firsthand the attitudes that had consigned Asian actors to cliched or minor roles.
He was filming The Green Hornet, and he was still in his Kato uniform. And the producers came out and said, "Boy," he said, "where's your car?" He said, "You need to go pick up this other actress right now." He said, "Excuse me, boy?" And so Thordis, who's an actress, says, "Do you know who he is?" He said, "This is Bruce Lee. He plays Kato in The Green Hornet." And they just shunned him away like it was no big deal. So this was the mentality at that time. An Asian man in a chauffeur uniform, he's just a servant, you know? What Bruce Lee told Thordis Brandt next kind of dictated the way his whole philosophy was. She said, "Does that bother you?" And he said, "Does it bother me?" He said, "If I let it bother me, I wouldn't be Bruce Lee."
But Bruce Lee he was, and after making only a handful of screen appearances, he changed the way Asians would be portrayed on screen forever.
One man, not a whole group of people, but one guy, turned the image of a Chinese guy from a little guy with buck teeth and wire-rimmed glasses who's an accountant to the image of a fighting philosopher, a peaceful warrior.
The film that propelled this fighting philosopher into the public's consciousness was Enter the Dragon. It was the fourth and last film Bruce Lee made, and the first co-production between a Hollywood and an Asian film company.
Enter the Dragon is the movie that really put Bruce Lee on the world stage. And the reason for that is purely it's in English. A lot of people saw a Bruce Lee movie who otherwise would not have done so. But you look at the movie as a whole, the performances, the writing, the cinematography, everything is great about Enter the Dragon. And Bruce Lee's in a great movie. It's not just a haphazard picture with Bruce Lee elevating it. So a lot of the critics were wrong about Enter the Dragon, and over time, it's been reappraised as an extraordinary film, as it is.
Enter the Dragon was also the first martial arts film with mass cultural appeal.
Culturally, it spoke to everybody. You know, you had Jim Kelly in there representing African Americans. You had John Saxon representing Europeans. And you had Bruce representing Asia. So culturally, I mean, it was well-rounded.
But an English language martial arts film had never been made. So Bruce Lee and his Hollywood partners had no idea if anyone in the West would care. It was unique and very risky.
It was a hugely stressful time for Bruce because he wanted so much for it to be a wonderful, fabulous entry for him into the American film market. He was very perfectionist about how he wanted the script to be and who he wanted to be in it and the choreography of the fight scenes and all that. So he was involved in every aspect of that film.
Actor John Saxon had no idea of the film's impact until the premiere.
I was in the back of a limo and peered out the window and I saw a line of people. And the car kept moving and I kept seeing that the line was extended and extended and extended. And finally, passing the block, I saw that it went down the street. And I said, "What the hell's going on there?" They said, "That's your film." I said, "My film?" And it hit me.
The film was a phenomenal success, taking in $3 million in the US in its first 7 weeks. Costing less than $1 million and generating $200 million, Bruce Lee's breakthrough film went on to become one of the most commercially successful films ever made. Enter the Dragon was not just a financial success. It also became a cultural phenomenon. When it opened in 1973, it started a craze for a new form of martial arts known as Kung Fu in Cantonese, but Kung Fu to everyone else.
After Enter the Dragon, everybody wanted to be a Bruce Lee. And you had a martial arts studio opening up almost on every corner. In the East Coast, the West Coast, around the world, everybody wanted to be a Bruce Lee. They were seeking that. They wanted to be that.
My wife's brother was opening up a martial arts gym in Knoxville, Tennessee. So I went there to talk. There were their mother's children with 5-year-olds and so on, bringing these 5-year-old girls as well to me. This is Mr. Saxon. He was in that, and I said, yes, that's right, that's right. Did your mother make you come here? What made you come here and do this? I saw Enter the Dragon.
Soon everybody was kung fu fighting across the globe, and pop stars from Donny Osmond to the king of rock and roll himself were showing off their kung fu kicks.
Without Bruce Lee and Enter the Dragon, it might have been years and years and years, and maybe not at all, that martial arts as a genre would have become available.
Bruce intellectualized the art form, and his persona in films brought it to the world. It brought martial arts to the world, it brought kung fu to the world, but it also brought Asian cinema to the world.
As well as introducing the world to kung fu, Bruce Lee also introduced another new word to the West, the name of a little-known Asian weapon called the nunchuck.
His use of weaponry and his skill with the weaponry, I mean, you can see that the guy didn't, it wasn't tricks. It wasn't just, okay, camera tricks. Would probably spend hundreds and thousands of hours practicing with the nunchucks, you know, and he barely blinked. I mean, he was a master over the medium and over his artistry.
It looked like he was almost breakdancing with the nunchucks that rolled around on the floor, hitting everyone's ankles with the nunchucks.
Bruce Lee was really ahead of his time in terms of figuring out how to create unique, iconic emblems or things that would be uniquely Bruce Lee. What he did was he chose as his signature weapon the Seonji-Kwan, the nunchaku. So as soon as you see those two, that weapon, you think Bruce Lee.
The kung fu Bruce Lee demonstrated on screen was all about realism, much like his own creation, known as Jeet Kune Do. It was a revolutionary approach to fighting that would change the world of martial arts forever. Bruce Lee not only introduced the world to martial arts, he also reinvented it, creating his own called Jeet Kune Do, being practiced here in Hong Kong. It's the forerunner of the mixed martial arts scene in UFC. Its key principles: simplicity, economy, and being as direct as possible.
Jeet Kune Do is called the way of intercepting fists. Actually, Bruce Lee has explained his Jeet Kune Do as the art of fighting without fighting. So that means if we don't allow our opponent to start a fight, then there will be no fighting. And that is the highest technique and the ultimate aim.
In a fight situation, Bruce Lee's ultimate aim was to take his opponent out before he had a chance to attack, using any means necessary.
In Jeet Kune Do, we can sum it up in 3 important words: simple, direct, and non-classical. By simple, it means the techniques we go for simplicity. It's not adding on, but taking away. The less technique you have, the better you are. By direct, you don't go things here and there, but direct to the point. Non-classical, that means you don't follow the old ways of doing things.
It's a simple concept, but the theory behind it took Bruce Lee many years to develop. Hong Kong in the 1950s was a tough place to grow up. Thousands of Chinese had flooded into the city to escape the communist regime on the mainland, leading to overcrowding and unemployment. Youths would organize into gangs to protect themselves and their territory, and the young Bruce Lee was no exception. Despite coming from a relatively well-off family, the teenage Bruce Lee was often involved in gang fights.
You have one clan against another clan. You have the Wing Chun clan against the Choi Le Foot Clan. And there was a lot of battles in the streets. And, you know, Bruce was very sure of himself and knew he can handle himself. So, you know, the Gung Sao matches, which are the rooftop fighting matches, happened a lot, and Bruce was part of them.
After getting beaten one time, Bruce Lee decided to learn a martial art that could be used in real-life situations. He began by learning Wing Chun, and by the time he arrived in Seattle in 1959, he was a competent teacher. Taki Kimura was one of Bruce Lee's first students and closest friends.
This young man at 18 was a holy terror in terms of athleticism. I mean, he was all Hong Kong champion cha-cha dancer. His brother was all Hong Kong champion fencer, so he became an avid fencer. And of course, he did a lot of boxing on the street, you know, in the fights and things. He had a pretty good hold on boxing, and so this guy, when he came over, he was an all-around athlete.
Taki Kimura was one of a small but dedicated group of followers who Bruce Lee began teaching in Seattle. Another of his first students was his wife-to-be, Linda.
You would just pass through a doorway here, and it would go down the stairs into the basement, and it was just a plain room with concrete walls and swinging light bulb, and he had, maybe 10 or 12 students at the most at one time in a class.
In 1966, the couple moved to Los Angeles for Bruce to start work on the Green Hornet. He opened up a gym in Oakland and also began teaching private students, including actors Steve McQueen and James Coburn. It was during this period that he began mixing different fighting styles to develop his own martial art of Jeet Kune Do.
He was frustrated by the limits of traditional martial arts. So if you did karate, you didn't do any ground fighting, or you didn't do any throws. If you did judo, you didn't do any punching or kicking. You know, if you did kung fu, you had to stand a certain way and strike a certain way and do set combinations of moves. And he thought all of that was just getting in the way and being impractical. You had to be adaptable because fighting could go anywhere. Fighting wasn't contained by rules. If someone was going to attack you, who knew what they'd do? So you had to be ready for anything. So that was quite a revolutionary way of thinking.
Since creating Jeet Kune Do, Bruce Lee's martial art has spread as far afield as Scotland. This is Glasgow, one of the most violent cities in Europe. More people die of assaults here than almost any other European city. Tommy Carruthers is a former club doorman who turned to Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do to protect himself from violent attack.
I would say the preferred weapon in Glasgow would be the knife. There's more stabbings here than anything else.
Tommy was trained by Bruce Lee's last private student and protege, Ted Wong. Since taking up Jeet Kune Do, he's become one of the top practitioners and one of the few people in the world qualified to teach it. He uses Jeet Kune Do to train people in self-defense so that they can use it if attacked on the street.
We really try and take the stuff and apply it to real-life situations, because the guys are here really to learn how to fight.
Tommy Carruthers reveals the key to Jeet Kune Do, its simplicity and economy, making it useful in a real attack. In some martial arts, an arm grab might entail a series of complicated moves, but not in Jeet Kune Do.
Traditional martial arts seems to be a long-winded affair about going from point A to point B. There's many ways we could show you to give an example. If you look at Bruce's idea, and it's really just based on what would be the closest and where your hands and feet are in relation to the opponent. I just feel in this situation here that because my leg is near his knee, but the groin feels an easier target, so if I was grabbed, I feel as if the groin shot would be easier. This would be a better move than just doing this. And again, we could punch.
Bruce Lee's revolutionary approach to fighting has been adopted around the world in sports such as the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Violent and competitive combat using mixed martial arts.
He was always trying to figure out the science of fighting. And the reality is, you have to have a little piece of everything to be a complete fighter. That's what mixed martial arts is. And Bruce Lee is the father of mixed martial arts.
Bruce Lee's daughter, Shannon, has come to Las Vegas to see her father's influence in action.
Talked about Kenny Florian. Good kick by
My dad would have really enjoyed UFC. I think he was very into real combat. His art is all about being a complete fighter and being able to handle any situation you find yourself in. And so this is really the closest you can get to it.
Mixed martial arts is now one of the fastest growing sports in the world. This UFC heavyweight title fight, where Randy Couture famously lost his crown to Brock Lesnar, was one of the biggest pay-per-view events of the year. It attracted more than 1 million viewers and generated more than $50 million in sales. Bruce Lee's influence on the sport is acknowledged by many of the fighters.
I've been watching his movies, studying his martial art and philosophy since I was like 8 to 10 years old, and it completely changed my entire aspect on fighting.
Once again, it's Bruce Lee's focus on economy, simplicity, and directness that clicks with UFC fighters.
What Bruce Lee used to do was work on circular movement. So if that jab came, he'd work things like this so that he's opening up targets here. In kickboxing nowadays, or MMA, we're doing the same kind of motions, only we're just limiting here so that our body is still open, so that I can do things like take people down, or I can parry that punch, just throw a kick. But it's that same basic principle of redirecting motion.
He said that if you can't do something live, it's pointless. So what I need to do is take those tactics and those techniques, remove them, and put them in live training scenarios, sparring. And you have to learn what is gonna work in all these different scenarios and be able to employ that right away, without thinking, muscle memory. In Enter the Dragon, the first scene in the movie, they have mixed martial arts gloves. Those are almost exactly the same kind of gloves we fight in today. So the gear he used back then is the same gear we use today. And you see Bruce Lee hit a takedown and go into an armbar, which before UFC, the general public didn't know what an armbar is. But now looking back, 30 years back, 40 years back, we're seeing before anyone really knew what it was, he was employing these tactics.
And while Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do revolutionized the world of martial arts, his approach to health and physical fitness would change the way other athletes and sports people train their bodies forever. Martial artists and sportsmen admire him for his physical dexterity, power, and speed. Philosophers respect him for bridging the philosophical divide between East and West. But here at Gold's Gym in Venice Beach, California, are another group of people who hold Bruce Lee up as an inspiration for their community. The bodybuilders. Gold's Gym is the mecca of bodybuilding. It was here that Arnold Schwarzenegger trained, and where many of the world's champion bodybuilders come to hone their physiques. Flex Wheeler is one of the most successful bodybuilders of his generation, winning numerous titles before retiring in 2002.
Probably two of the biggest things that Bruce Lee was known as far as his physical attribute. One would be his lats, because he had incredible lats, and then also his abs. Another thing also would be from the rear, his back. In bodybuilding, we call it a Christmas tree. So for a person, you know, having a Christmas tree back in that era is just profoundly unknown or unheard of.
Other bodybuilding luminaries, such as Lou Ferrigno, Lee Haney, Dorian Yates, as well as Mr. Schwarzenegger, have all expressed the huge impact Bruce Lee's physique had on them.
There are a surprising number of professional bodybuilders who are Bruce Lee fans. And really it comes down to Bruce's abs. He has a legendary set of abs, deep cuts, incredible serratus muscles, and I think bodybuilders admire that.
In the bodybuilding world, I think Bruce Lee came in and really was one of the first proponents of definition as opposed to just sheer bulk. Because if you look at the bodybuilding champions of that era, they were all just massive, they were just huge. And there was him who really came in and said symmetry, definition, you know, getting cut was the big thing. But that was the first time, it was really with Bruce Lee that became something to aspire to.
As well as inspiring bodybuilders, Bruce Lee was quick to use their techniques in his own workouts.
He was kind of a pioneer in a number of different things, whether it was his dieting or extra training, but he was one of the first that I knew of that actually incorporated, bodybuilding and bodybuilding type movements into his regime as a martial artist. Back then, even now, they felt that in training and weightlifting, it's going to restrict your ability to punch or your speed or make you kind of slow or stuff like that, where I think he took it to a different level and he made it more sports specific on his actual movements that he did in a gym. They were actually to enhance his ability as a fighter.
The spur for Bruce Lee to start weight training came after a fight in San Francisco in 1965. He just started teaching Kung Fu. When a traditional practitioner of the art heard Bruce Lee was teaching Westerners, he challenged him to a fight. A pregnant Linda Lee was there to witness it.
It lasted about 3 minutes. Bruce got the fellow down to the ground and said, "Do you give up? Do you give up?" And he said, "I give up." So they went back to San Francisco. However, it upset Bruce mightily that he had not dispatched that man in under 3 minutes. And that's when he began to question his physical fitness and his way of martial arts.
Bruce Lee decided to re-examine both his fighting and training methods and began an intensive program of physical conditioning.
He had a program for every single day. So he did aerobic type things. He rode his bike, he rode a stationary bike, he ran, he jumped rope, all those kind of things for aerobic conditioning. And then he did sit-ups forever, which he had the wonderful washboard abs. And he did strength exercising with weights all the time. And he was very specific. He read books on kinesiology, so he would know how to develop his body.
As well as studying the science of human movement, Bruce Lee also designed his own weight training equipment, built by a close friend.
George Lee made a couple things for him that were specifically to develop grip strength and the size of Bruce's forearm. Bruce thought that led to an increase in punching power. But one was a grip that you clench your fist open and shut to work your forearm muscles. It's actually a lot like the stuff you see in sporting goods stores now.
Bruce Lee's training regimen helped him reach high levels of stamina, speed, and agility. It allowed him to perform feats of superhuman strength, such as a 2-fingered push-up, seen here in rare archive footage from a karate tournament in 1967. He also perfected a super fast and powerful blow, known as the 1-inch punch.
This guy was probably the fastest person I've ever seen. And he had that strength. I mean, the 1-inch punch, for instance, he would knock you clear across the room.
Lee's speed was legendary. Even when slowed down to a quarter speed, his strike is still hard to capture on camera.
He could stand 5 feet away from you, leap in there and tap you on your face and be back here standing before you could move, before you could intercept it. And then every time they'd say, "Well, wait a minute, I wasn't ready, do it again." And he'd do it about 2 more times and they'd say, "Oh, hell, I can't put up with that,
I think a lot of the speed and timing that Bruce Lee had was from the conditioning and strength and the way his body worked. He was very, very concerned with his fast twitch muscle. That 1-inch punch that he developed, one of the fastest strikes and still used today, and that transfers over, obviously, into the boxing side.
This ability to pack a punch has been acknowledged by some of the world's best boxers.
That was the most amazing thing about Bruce, was the fact that he could generate so much speed and velocity in his punches. Short punches that he used his body and the type of leverage he was able to gain, because he understood the mechanics of the body.
Bruce Lee didn't just confine himself to exercising his muscles. He was also concerned with the fuel he was putting into his body. He began experimenting with high-protein drinks that he blended himself and supplemented with ginseng, royal jelly, and massive doses of vitamins.
He was very known for taking vitamins and minerals and stuff like that, and he had to go and find these various different ones and put them together, where now we can just walk into any store and be able to buy certain supplements like that. So a lot of the things he was doing as an athlete back then is things that we incorporate now as bodybuilders.
Bruce Lee's approach to high-protein drinks was revolutionary and shocked some of his colleagues when he returned to Hong Kong.
At that time, when we were not making movies, we would go to his house. He showed us how he ate beef, raw beef from the US. He put the raw beef into the blender and added milk, 7 eggs, and then wow, he gulped that thing down. We were terrified. It was amazing.
And it wasn't just his high-protein shakes that shocked his friends.
Sometimes he used electric current. It was really mad, giving himself electric shocks voluntarily. He was fighting with the electricity. Of course, we could not do it. I do not know how many volts the electricity was, but he was challenging the electricity.
You know, it's really funny that nowadays, if you go to any professional sports orthopedist place or physical therapist, you go in there and you see them using the electronic stimulation machines to rebuild muscles to help damaged areas. But way before that was employed in any physician's room, you saw Bruce Lee doing that at home on his own. He was just truly a pioneer and way ahead of his time.
Revolutionizing attitudes towards health and physical fitness is just one of the many ways Bruce Lee changed the world. But while the West has been quick to recognize his achievements, it's only recently that China and Hong Kong have begun to embrace their best-known son. It's been more than 35 years since the man universally hailed as the king of martial arts movies died after making just 4 kung fu films. Since his death, Bruce Lee has been recognized as a visionary who changed not just action movies and martial arts, but also philosophy, music, and pop culture. Almost 50 years after Bruce Lee arrived in Hong Kong to make his first kung fu movie, his daughter Shannon is returning. She's here to meet former friends of her father's and to promote the Bruce Lee Foundation that she now heads. Film producer Raymond Chow was Bruce Lee's friend and business partner. As head of Golden Harvest Studios, he was the biggest film producer in Hong Kong. Now aged 80, he stopped doing interviews some time ago, but has arranged to make an exception for Shannon, the daughter of a man he first saw on a television talk show nearly 40 years ago.
It's a fateful evening that I watched that, so I decided to call him first thing in the morning. And I would say that's the beginning of something important in the movie industry.
Bruce Lee changed the way actors were treated by studios by negotiating his own contract and taking a creative role in the writing, producing, directing, and choreography of his films.
You and my father had kind of an interesting and revolutionary relationship for the Hong Kong film industry, right?
Yes, I think that's the only fair way to do it. And it avoids a lot of problems of negotiating things. And Bruce and I, the relationship was so close. He didn't want to have that. I didn't want to have that.
The first film Bruce Lee made with Raymond Chow was The Big Boss, about the struggle of the Chinese community in Bangkok.
Right, Cheng. Remember your promise. You're on your own from now on. You know, boy, a woman can be a blessing or a ruin to a man.
The Big Boss was a classic example of the way a Hong Kong movie ran at the time, which was fast, cheap, and a little bit out of control.
Having left America to make his name in the East, it was an important film for Lee. It was made on a shoestring budget, and he struggled to turn an incomplete script into a coherent and captivating story. Knowing that the film could make or break him, Bruce Lee sat nervously with his wife Linda at the premiere.
When the film was over, it was perfectly quiet. You could hear a pin drop in that theater, and Bruce is like, oh my gosh, do I make for the exit right now or what? And then all of a sudden it started. The clapping, the cheering, they loved it. They were thrilled, and Bruce was thrilled. It was wonderful. They escorted him outside. They raised him up on their shoulders, and he was their hero from then on.
Also in the audience was a 24-year-old assistant director who was yet to make his first feature film. John Woo would go on to become one of the most influential action movie directors of his generation, responsible for films such as Broken Arrow, Face Off, and Mission Impossible 2.
When the people watched the movie, they didn't know how to react to it because, you know, it's so new and so different. It's so different from other martial arts movie. You know, maybe Bruce's performance too powerful. And then after they find a real thing, and then they're all very happy and they all cheer and clapping, you know. I think at that moment, and at that night, we have found our true hero. And from that night, Bruce Lee became a legend.
Despite costing less than $100,000, The Big Boss smashed all local box office records. But even before the premiere, Bruce Lee had already started working on his next film, Fist of Fury, a film that would help create a sense of patriotism in Hong Kong.
At the beginning of the film, there's this whole thing where they give him the sign saying, Dong A Beng Fu, sick men of Asia. And he comes back and he says, Hong Kong people. Chinese people are not sick men of Asia. And I think Hong Kong people were like, Hong Kong people are not sick men. They took that message to heart and they cheered him on. He was really like the prodigal son returning back to be embraced by Hong Kong as a community. But I think that's his place was, he was part of a movement to create an indigenous identity for Hong Kong people, and I think that identity continues to this day.
China in the early 70s was caught up in the Cultural Revolution, which was a hideous, hideous, bloody interlude in modern Chinese history where hundreds of thousands of people died, children turned on their parents. It was awful. And you had people running away from China, fleeing to Hong Kong and saying, our country is drowning in blood. People couldn't be proud of that China. So instead they were proud of this mythological China, and the place that mythological China came from were movies. It was like buying a ticket to a movie theater. It was like getting a passport to what you knew was in your heart was the real China. And that was one of the things that Bruce Lee saw.
For many Chinese people, the strong character played by Bruce Lee was both revolutionary and inspiring.
We were so weak, and we had been looked down by so many. So after Fist of Fury, they feel they are not sick anymore, and they become strong. It's all because of Bruce Lee.
We are not sick men.
As in The Big Boss, Bruce Lee played a nationalist hero. The character struck a chord with Chinese audiences, so with his third film, Way of the Dragon, he played on the same themes. This fight scene with karate champion Chuck Norris in the Colosseum in Rome is celebrated by martial arts fans as an all-time classic. Once again, Lee plays an upstanding and understated Chinese character that defeats his non-Chinese foe.
It also had encouraged me to make my own film with the real Chinese spirit. You know, that's how I got the influence. You know, and also make me believe if you work hard, you will succeed. You know, same as Bruce Lee.
Today, decades after becoming an unlikely star in Hong Kong, Bruce Lee is now embraced as an icon for all of China. In recognition of his contribution to Chinese culture, the authorities there are opening a $25 million memorial park near Bruce Lee's ancestral home of Shinde.
You know, it is the ancestral home of my family, so I've always wanted to go and see that just from a historical point of view. And it's a very interesting trip for me because I've never actually crossed the border from Hong Kong into China. So this is my first time going there, traveling by bus, and I'm just really excited to see it. Also to see what they have, you know, for my father there.
Before Shannon visits the memorial park, she's been invited to see her grandfather's house to take part in a traditional incense burning ceremony. Word has spread of Shannon's visit, and the whole town turns out to welcome her. Complete with a nunchuck-spinning Bruce Lee look-alike. The park is spread over 1.9 million square kilometers. As well as a museum, it will eventually host an 18-meter-high statue of Bruce Lee. For decades, the Chinese government banned Bruce Lee's films, but his attitudes towards free enterprise and individualism have softened. They've realized that Bruce Lee is an ideal icon for the new China.
His spirit is the same as that of the Chinese people, which is never say die, be unyielding, and keep striving. Values which are promoted in China nowadays.
The museum in China looks set to be followed by one in Hong Kong, where they intend to turn Bruce Lee's former house into a museum as well. Bruce moved into this house in 1971 and lived there until his death in 1973. This is the first time Shannon has been back since.
I lived here from the age of 2 to the age of 4. You know, it looks very different than it did before. It was much more of a home. There was grass, and so it's a little different, but it's very nice, very reminiscent for me to be back here.
Yu Panglin is a billionaire real estate and hotel owner and one of China's most generous philanthropists. He's agreed to donate the house to the government so long as they let him expand the building to include a cinema, shops, and a library.
I think it's such a natural fit. I mean, my father, though he was born in the United States, he grew up here. His family lived here. Shunda is just very near to here, so it seems really natural for there to be a museum here. But you know, Hong Kong is a hustling, bustling, ever-changing place. It's hard to find a dedicated space for such a thing. And so, you know, now that he's willing to donate, this just seems like such a natural idea, so I think it just makes all the sense in the world.
The news of this museum coincides with another sign of the Chinese government's relaxing attitude, with the broadcast of a 50-part television series on the state-run channel called The Legend of Bruce Lee. It's not available on Hong Kong TV, so tonight will be the first time many fans of Bruce Lee here will get to see it.
It was pretty amazing, and it kind of gives you a whole new understanding of who he is as, you know, as a martial arts person and as a family man and, you know, as a professional.
I think it's pretty amazing that China has wanted to embrace my father in this way. You know, I think they look at my father as somebody who influenced the world. He sort of bridged the gap, as you will, between East and West, and he did it 35 years ago. And now here's China coming out to the world, essentially having a coming out party to the world. And so I think they see him as a metaphor in a way for themselves, and they really are embracing that.
It's taken China more than 35 years to embrace its most famous son. The Mammoth series has become the most watched TV drama in the channel's history. And incredibly, the techniques used in the filming and fight scenes were those pioneered by Bruce Lee more than 35 years ago, when he changed the way action films would be made forever. Hong Kong has for many years been the action movie capital of the world. Bruce Lee returned here in 1970 to make his 4 kung fu films and revolutionize the way fight scenes in movies were filmed.
You wanna fight? I'll take you on.
Stunt coordinator Thomas Sin is a kung fu master who took up martial arts after seeing Bruce Lee.
The thinking, fighting, and pictures in his movies are still innovative today. He just advanced dozens of years ahead of us.
Today, he's practicing wire work, where a stunt double is attached to wires to mimic the appearance of flying. It's a technique that's been used in Hong Kong filmmaking for almost 50 years and is best known from films like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Despite having free rein to use special effects, it was something Bruce Lee avoided. For Lee, realism was everything. The portrayal of his martial arts had to be as close to real life as possible.
Well, if you look at the guys who came before him, especially in Hong Kong cinema, these movies contain very little authentic martial arts at all. It's mostly a lot of trampolines and wire stunts. Look at the Chinese boxer. The fight scenes are terrible. It's a lot of swinging your arms and people falling over, and then some very obvious and awkward wire work in which people shoot straight up into the air or do flips off trampolines.
Donnie Yen is one of the biggest names in Hong Kong cinema. He's appeared in more than 30 action movies in both Hong Kong and Hollywood, including Shanghai Nights with Jackie Chan and Hero.
Bruce Lee believed in having authentic martial arts, being an authentic martial artist, to be a martial art actor. He was the very first came out and said, look, you have to be real when you kick, when you punch, you have to be real.
Bruce Lee was renowned for doing his own stunts, but would fight against stuntmen in his films. Jackie Chan began his film career as a stuntman in Fist of Fury and Enter the Dragon. He found that Lee's quest for realism came with a price.
It's one stick right on my head. You know, one. I just I do the reaction, drop, do nothing, bam, fall down. But he just bang, do whatever he like to do. Finished, run away, then cut.
Bruce Lee was uncompromising in his attempts to get realistic fight scenes, but he was sympathetic towards his stuntmen.
I just hear, oh my God, and probably some dirty word, some like a shoe, you know, drop the stick, run to me, and pull me up. I'm terrible sorry. I said, I'm okay. You know, I'm okay. No, on a stunt guy, never say hurt. I'm okay, no. And he touched me and kissed my face. You know, just do whatever, but I ready to get hurt.
Lee's use of real martial arts, combined with his speed and director's eye, was groundbreaking.
Bruce Lee totally revolutionized the way unarmed combat would be presented on screen. What Bruce Lee had done, because he worked in Hollywood with so many quality filmmakers, came back, he learned which lens to use, how to move the camera, where to edit. And these are what make his fights so remarkable. The techniques sometimes are really quite basic. The way he shot them was revolutionary.
Yeah, his action is a kind of a new wave action. You know, he changed the whole thing. You know, because we have never seen fighting like that.
The whole sort of like fast and slow thing he did with the tension and the release. The scenes that would move, then stop, then move again. Bruce Lee really made that stylized and really built that up and turned that into something that, I think that's the influence for Western movies.
He made fighting entertaining. He made it fun. He made it dramatic. He made it emotional. And he really brought martial arts to the rest of the world.
But Bruce Lee disappeared almost as quickly as he'd emerged on July 20th, 1973, dying of a brain edema just weeks before Enter the Dragon was released. The cause was put down to an allergic reaction to a painkiller. His death sent shockwaves around the world, prompting the biggest public gathering in Hong Kong's history. He was laid to rest in Seattle, with former students Steve McQueen and James Coburn as pallbearers.
I had decided to send Bruce's body back to Seattle. It was not a popular opinion in Hong Kong because they thought of Bruce as their son in Hong Kong, but that's what I decided.
Bruce Lee's sudden death left a vacuum as the world clamored to see more of this new Asian superstar. A rash of Bruce Lee lookalikes and copycat films emerged, inspiring a whole new film genre, known as Bruceploitation.
The whole Bruceploitation genre really took off after his death in the 70s, as film producers in Hong Kong were desperate to find, someone else to make some money off of.
And right after he died, it was Bruce Lie, Bruce this one, Bruce Jump Over the Fruit, Bruce Jackson from Compton. It's all these Bruces. There's only one.
There got to be over 50 to 100 titles of movies with Bruce Lee name in it that has no Bruce Lee in it. There have to be at least a dozen or more Asian actors that was called Bruce Lee by the advertisers, and they didn't even know about it because those movies are made in Hong Kong and just sent out to the world.
Bruce Lee had been working on his 5th film when he died, called Game of Death. He'd filmed what would amount to 11 minutes and 7 seconds of edited footage as he fought 3 styles of martial artists on his way up a pagoda.
What Bruce was trying to convey in the Game of Death was how to deal with different forms. One martial artist going against people using different fighting styles has to overcome each of them. So in order to do that, you have to be versatile. You can't just take the same approach to dealing with different problems.
But the footage presented the studio with a major problem: how to finish the film without Bruce Lee.
Years go by, Bruce has passed away, and then the Hong Kong film studio, Golden Harvest, wanted to do something with the film that existed from Game of Death. And I believe they made 2 films and spliced together another actor and parts Bruce and part this other actor, and it looks spliced together.
It looks like a joke, it looks like a gag, because the attempts to make it look like Bruce are in the early part of the movie are so laughable. There's a scene in which the face of a body double is obscured by sticking a photo of Bruce on a mirror.
Among the many Bruce Lee imitators that appeared after his death, a few actors emerged who began to establish themselves as unique talents in their own right. 2 of the most successful were former stuntmen and members of the Peking Opera School, Sammo Hung and Jackie Chan.
Really, the guy who was smart about it was Jackie Chan. When he finally got to have some sort of say in the direction of his career, stopped trying to imitate Bruce and, you know, in the spirit of Bruce, found his own path by doing kung fu comedies.
After Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan is the biggest name in kung fu and action films. Nowadays to be found in Beijing more than Hollywood, he long had to struggle against being hailed as the next Bruce Lee.
Nobody can be a Bruce Lee. There's only one Bruce Lee, but all the director, martial art director, want every actor becoming a second Bruce Lee. The way you point, the way you fight, nobody can do it for him. But the audience, no, he's the best. Bruce Lee is the best.
Jackie has appeared in over 100 films, but is best known in the West for his appearances alongside Chris Tucker in the Rush Hour trilogy, playing a very different role to Bruce Lee.
Bruce Lee is very strong. He's a very, like an iron guy. Nobody can beat him. I want to be an underdog. Everybody can beat me. And when Bruce Lee punch like this, me after punch, hurt. I want to be a real human.
As well as opening the doors for action stars like Jackie Chan, Bruce Lee has also been the inspiration for many others.
I did a movie called Mindhunters, and I had a scene where I had to walk with a gun down this, like a dark military facility, and I really thought about Bruce Lee and really thought about the way he approached things when I was going through that scene, and just my movements. And when it played back on tape, it looked so fluid because I really thought about, you know, the way he approached things. So he definitely is very influential.
Like LL Cool J, Eddie Griffin says Bruce Lee inspired him professionally and made him want to take up martial arts.
Oh, I did this movie called Undercover Brother. And, you know, it's about this brother who, rather than use a gun, Undercover Brother solves it with his hands. He's a Bruce Lee fanatic. From the time I could remember Bruce Lee. It's the reason I got into the art.
As well as a multitude of Bruce Lee-inspired actors that emerged after his death, many filmmakers sought to pay homage to him by referencing him in their movies. Brett Ratner is one such director, duplicating the fight scene from The Game of Death, as well as the opening shot from Enter the Dragon.
I found that exact location that they shot. I had someone take me there that worked on the movie, and that's where I shot the opening shot of Rush Hour. In Rush Hour 3, I did kind of the reverse. You had a Chinese guy, Bruce Lee, obviously fighting Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. We reversed it. I had a black guy fighting a Chinese giant. You know, I said to my producer, find me the largest Chinese man you can. And he happened to be the second largest man in the world, which is Sun Mingming, who's 7'9". So yeah, so those Bruce Lee movies have tremendous influence on the choices I make.
Bruce Lee has been endlessly referenced in Hong Kong movies, Chinese movies, Japanese movies even, Canadian movies, but he's also been endlessly referenced in Hollywood movies. You've got him in the yellow tracksuit from Game of Death. You've got him right there in Kill Bill, Quentin Tarantino's film with Uma Thurman. In Rush Hour, you have uses of his yells and his cries that are in there. Anytime someone gives a yell in a Western movie, it's a Bruce Lee thing.
Running for your lives!
Filmmakers and actors across the globe cite Bruce Lee as their guiding influence to want to make movies. And despite only making 4 action films, his influence is being felt to this day.
His profound legacy is that he created, on a worldwide stage, Asian action cinema. And in the wake of that, you've had the success of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and The Matrix, and the Jackie Chan movies, and the Jet Li movies, and all that you've had. And you would not have had that without Bruce Lee.
Bruce Lee changed the worlds of film, philosophy, martial arts, and physical fitness. But he also had a profound effect on the creative arts, influencing music and musicians around the world.
So what we're doing right now, we're in the studio with the RZA, got my crew in here, and we're working on a project called Afro Samurai, starring Sam Jackson and Lucy Liu. It's called You Already Know. Check it out.
Robert F. Diggs, aka RZA, is working on his latest film score. He's a prodigious music producer, rapper, and sometimes actor. He's also the mastermind of the hip-hop band the Wu-Tang Clan, and a devoted fan of Bruce Lee.
You know, when I think about, Bruce Lee and martial arts and things and the influence on me, it's been a strong influence on me. Look at my first album, it's called Enter the Wu-Tang, 36 Chambers. That's basically taking the title Enter the Dragon, you know what I mean, and putting it and applying it to ourselves.
The group's 1993 debut, Enter the Wu-Tang 36 Chambers, was the first album to mix rhymes with dialogue sampled from underground Hong Kong movies. The band has sold nearly 6 million albums, all featuring snippets from producer RZA's personal collection of action imports.
1, 2, 3. And some pianos.
As well as being influenced by Bruce Lee and Kung Fu movies, RZA says there are also parallels between the improvisational nature of rapping and martial arts.
I come from the era of hip hop where people would battle each other on the subway trains, in the school bathrooms, on the street corners, and it's almost like a martial art fight. You know what I mean? It's like a martial art fight actually, because you're flowing, you're throwing your best weapons, which is your lyrical weapons, and you're trying to defeat this guy by saying the most wittiest thing.
Bruce Lee has a tremendous influence in the culture of hip hop, because it's really taking an ethnic icon and reappropriating this ethnic icon to your own ethnicity and to your own sort of outsider culture.
Bruce in the martial arts world is a virtuoso. He's constantly improvising. It's like Miles Davis with his hands and feet. And that's what hip hop does, is improvising. You're freestyling on the mic.
Improvisation in Jeet Kune Do can be mirrored by broken rhythm. And this also reflects in rap music, jazz music, all sorts of music, rock music.
Improvisation lies at the core of breakdancing, where dancers are continually adapting their moves. This Brooklyn-based New York dance crew specialize in a dance form called uprocking, which mixes salsa, the hustle, and action moves, which were added to imitate a fight against an opposing dancer. The leader of the crew is Ralph Casanova, also known as King Uprock. He says Bruce Lee was a big influence on their dance style.
Rocking started in Brooklyn, where a lot of guys were gang members.
And b-boying was really popular in the Bronx, where they were doing more of the backspins and stuff like that, acrobatic moves. See, everybody was watching Bruce Lee and learning different dances that they took something of him and added in the flavor of the dance they were doing.
After the launch of Enter the Dragon in the 1970s, dancers were quick to replicate Bruce Lee's kung fu moves and incorporate them into their dances. Across America, numerous different dance styles emerged, known to most today simply as breakdancing.
And a lot of karate movies had like windmills and backspins, which they didn't call it that, but we used to watch all these moves and just take whatever we saw and add into breaking and rocking and other dances.
The man responsible for creating the music for the film that first inspired these dancers is composer Lalo Schifrin. As well as Enter the Dragon, he received 6 Oscar nominations for classics such as Mission Impossible, Cool Hand Luke, Bullet, and Dirty Harry. He believes there are parallels between how he approaches composing and how Bruce Lee approached his own martial art.
He said to me, martial arts started in India 5,000 years ago. And there were traditions, so I brought the traditions. And I said, you know something? We have something in common. Because 2,000 years of tradition of European classical music, I learned it, I studied too. And I brought the rules, I brought the tradition, so we have something in common. And he was very happy.
The soundtrack to Enter the Dragon sold more than 500,000 copies, earning Lalo Schifrin a gold record. It also went on to inspire Hollywood director Brett Ratner, who vowed to use Lalo for his first film after hearing the soundtrack.
I had the idea of working with Lalo because of the theme of Enter the Dragon, the way that he put Bruce's voice and his yelling, the mixture between the Chinese instrumentations and the urban cool grooves, which if you think about it, it's like Asian music and kind of black urban music combined to make that theme. And that's really what gave me the idea of Rush Hour.
Like Brett Ratner, Quentin Tarantino is another high-profile Hollywood director that has been inspired by Bruce Lee. When he wanted someone to do the soundtrack for the movie Kill Bill, he approached RZA to draw on his vast knowledge of Bruce Lee films.
Doing the music for Kill Bill was something that was a great opportunity for me. I'm a hip-hop producer, and Mr. Tarantino was a Wu-Tang fan and actually became the first composer he ever hired. And we actually met like 2 guys throwing out baseball cards, naming kung fu films, who knew the most films, and we became friends.
Like RZA, Damon Albarn from the British band Gorillaz saw Bruce Lee at an early age and was blown away. His band has sold over 15 million albums, and their latest project, a circus opera called Monkey Journey to the West, has been staged around the world. When creating the music for the opera, Damon Albarn drew on the soundtrack to Enter the Dragon.
I definitely thought about that when I was doing the music for the Monkey Opera. The strong use of orchestra, and it's just really exciting. It never became dull, you know.
Bruce Lee's influence has been apparent in much of the Gorillaz' work since they launched in 1998 as the world's first virtual band.
You always say that too.
They created their own Game of Death animation and dressed Monkey in Bruce Lee's signature yellow tracksuit.
You put Monkey in a Bruce Lee...
Yeah, but exactly. Monkey has a Bruce Lee tracksuit.
You can't really... It's so iconic.
The Gorillaz aren't the only artists to capitalize on Bruce Lee's image. The international appeal and strong brand identity is something advertisers and marketers have also been keen to exploit, creating a wave of Bruce Lee-inspired commercials, comics, and video games around the world. When Bruce Lee emerged in the early 1970s, he looked and acted like no one before, a larger-than-life superhero who could never be beaten. Stan Lee is the creative force behind Marvel Comics and is responsible for creating hundreds of superheroes, including Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, and the X-Men. He immediately saw the comic book potential in Bruce Lee.
You might say he was a superhero without a costume, and his superpower was really his agility and the fact that he fought in a way that we were not used to seeing.
A year after Enter the Dragon was released, Marvel Comics created the character Iron Fist, based on Bruce Lee. Further Bruce Lee-inspired characters followed, including Shang-Chi and the Hands of Kung Fu.
I'm quite sure we would not have done that book had there not been a Bruce Lee. I think that any character who in any way was a martial artist, you'd have to say that they owed their origin in some way to Bruce Lee, because he was the first one to make Westerners aware of that type of fighting and that type of a way of life.
With the advent of video games in the 1980s, designers were quick to pick up on the same characteristics that had made Bruce Lee translate so well into comics. In 1984, the Bruce Lee video game was released, followed by a slew of others. These included Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, and Bruce Lee, Quest of the Dragon, as well as numerous other games which took their inspiration from the king of martial arts.
Be water, my friend.
One thing we could definitely give Bruce Lee credit for is his inspiration into the martial art video games. You will notice that there's not one martial art video game that doesn't have a Bruce Lee character in it. If you even go back to the Street Fighter series or to Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat was one of the biggest arcade games to come out, and who they got? The guy Lee Kwan, looking just like Bruce Lee. Bouncing on his feet, looking like Bruce Lee.
Ralph LeMaitre is a senior games producer at the telecommunications giant Nokia. When the company wanted to develop a martial arts-inspired video game for their Engage platform, they turned to Ralph.
I loved Bruce Lee. That was the inspiration for the whole thing. I wanted always to do a martial arts game because I want to do something Bruce Lee-like.
But translating Bruce Lee's dynamism and fighting style into a game is no mean feat. To get the most realistic fighting simulation possible, Ralph decided to use a technique called motion capture, where human movement is filmed, then digitally recreated. After an extensive search, Ralph found the man he thought best captured Bruce Lee's speed and fighting style, a Jeet Kune Do instructor from Glasgow, named Tommy Carruthers.
And he's just Jeet Kune Do guy around the world. I mean, his speed, his power, and his precision, it's just unmatched. I just love looking what he does, you know.
And we shot, I think, 7 days, motion capture. We done all the footwork, punches and kicks, and we done the stunt work and fight choreographer, which was pretty hard work and pretty good, exciting, and something different. I've never done anything like that before.
The characteristics that have made Bruce Lee translate well into video games and comics have also been a gift to advertisers.
Partly because he was smart enough when he was alive to actually create aspects of his screen persona that are so identifiably Bruce Lee. You don't even need the name Bruce Lee. You don't even need to hear his voice to think, oh, that's Bruce Lee.
And with this instant recognition comes a set of values that people associate with Bruce Lee.
Bruce Lee defines Kung Fu. If you want to reference sort of strength and sleekness and speed and power, Bruce Lee is shorthand for all of those things.
What they're trying to sell is an image of perfection. Right, here's a guy who's really good at what he does, so my product is that good. So I can understand what they're doing.
The Bruce Lee brand can represent many things. There are many characteristics that he had, many aspects to his personality. It can represent purity, health, confidence, speed, even tragedy.
Ari Merkin is the CEO of the New York advertising agency, Toy. As well as being one of the most awarded creative directors in the world, he's also a huge fan of Bruce Lee, using him as the inspiration for many of his commercials.
Bruce Lee influenced me tremendously. Creativity is about sort of spitting out what you've got inside, you know, the things that have influenced you, the images that have stayed in your mind. Bruce Lee and all of the things that I took away from his movies always stayed in my mind.
Bruce Lee's image has been used in hundreds of advertisements around the world to sell everything from cars by BMW, Levi jeans, and confectionery.
Well, that's funny. I mean, Bruce Lee's image to this day is still used by many advertisers from so many diverse companies, from Mars bars to drinks in Japan to candy to many other things, because Bruce Lee sells.
In this Mars bar ad, a Bruce Lee lookalike is being attacked, but instead of using nunchucks, he opts for a far less threatening weapon.
It's a very effective ad. It does step a bit into the parody territory. It pays tribute to the man and the brand with its sign-off, which is a delicate version of a classic. The ad manages to acknowledge Bruce Lee movies as classics, thereby elevating the brand, thereby elevating the product. It's a win-win for both.
The Mars bar ad is one of a long line of commercials that pokes fun at Bruce Lee's image.
It's become okay to make fun of Bruce Lee a little bit.
35.
So when you get advertisements like the Brisk Iced Tea commercial, in which he's fighting the Karate Kid, I don't think anybody's offended by that. It's fun.
Brisk, baby!
One of the latest campaigns to use Bruce Lee's image is one for the Nokia N96 mobile phone that features Bruce Lee playing ping pong with nunchucks. Since it first appeared in China, it's had more than 1 million hits on YouTube across the world.
People are still finding ways to put Bruce Lee into new context, like the recent commercial in which someone dressed as Bruce in the inevitable tracksuit is playing ping pong using a pair of nunchakus. It all just adds to his legacy in its own way, and sort of passes it on to the next generation.
It's been more than 35 years since Bruce Lee's death, but there appears to be no let-up in interest, with numerous projects in the pipeline. These include Hollywood remakes of The Green Hornet and the 80s cult classic The Last Dragon, as well as a Broadway musical and a computer-generated Bruce Lee film in development from Spider-Man creator Stan Lee.
It's a fictional action movie in which we found a way to have Bruce Lee appear in this movie.
It's Bruce Lee's legacy that was foremost in people's minds when they gathered in Seattle for the 35th anniversary of his death. He's buried alongside his son Brandon, a rising actor who died in a tragic accident on the set of the film The Crow. Bruce Lee's grave has become a mecca for fans, with thousands turning up each year to pay their respects. Linda and Shannon have returned to celebrate the life of a devoted actor, husband, and father. They're joined by more than 400 people who have traveled from as far afield as Lee's ancestral home of Shunde in China.
We are so proud of him because he's Chinese.
It's a weekend dedicated to Lee's teaching as top Jeet Kune Do experts perform demonstrations. It's also a chance for Shannon and Linda to discuss how they are keeping the legacy alive, with plans for the first Bruce Lee museum on U.S. soil in Seattle, known as BLAM.
That's the Bruce Lee Action Museum. So she wanted it to represent movement and action and taking action, and make it also about community, research, philosophy, education, foundation, all of those different things.
It's July 20th, the day of Bruce Lee's death, and Linda, Shannon, and many of Bruce Lee's family and friends have gathered at his graveside to pay their respects.
This is Bruce's gravestone. In front of it is a book. And on the book it says, "Your inspiration continues to guide us toward our personal liberation." It's the journey that's important, it's not the destination.
Bruce Lee is also being remembered in other ways, with statues being erected to him in China and Los Angeles to follow those unveiled in Hong Kong and Bosnia, where he was chosen as a symbol of the fight against ethnic divisions. A spokesman said, "We will always be Muslims, Serbs, or Croats, but one thing we all have in common is Bruce Lee." It's been more than 35 years since the death of the man universally hailed as the king of martial arts movies, a man who changed the worlds of film, philosophy, physical fitness, music, and the arts. A man who died aged 32 before seeing the impact he created. A man who changed the world forever.
His impact was so incredibly powerful. I mean, you know, he just really hit popular culture in the solar plexus with the biggest right hand a man could throw. And I think we're still reeling from the blow.
In 1959, a young man left Hong Kong for the United States to claim his birthright citizenship. He was born on November 27, 1940 in San Francisco, but his family had returned to Hong Kong when he was an infant. His name was Bruce Lee. A philosophy major at the University of Washington, he supported himself by teaching fellow students his beloved Kung Fu. Here he met his future wife, Linda. They would have 2 children, Brandon and Shannon. Of all his students, they were Bruce's favorite. By 1964, he had 2 Kung Fu schools, one in Seattle and the other in Oakland, California. Bruce taught anyone who was interested, regardless of race.
His goal was to teach Kung Fu to many people all over America, and even to start a chain of schools around the country and expose Americans to his Chinese culture and martial arts.
When a group of Chinese martial arts masters ordered him to stop teaching non-Asians, he offered instead to fight their top man. Bruce defeated his opponent, keeping the right to teach whomever he wanted. After a successful screen test, Bruce was cast in The Green Hornet, based on the popular comic book hero, as the loyal sidekick, Kato. When the show premiered in 1966, American audiences were amazed. Producers asked Bruce to slow down because his movements were too fast for the camera.
Bruce Lee comes along in sort of cultural history at a time when the general impression of China and of Chinese people for the previous 100 years or so has been that sort of poor, uneducated, menial laborers, and China is considered a dysfunctional country. Bruce Lee creates this whole new persona.
The Green Hornet was canceled after just 1 season, and Bruce once again taught lessons, this time privately, often to celebrities like James Coburn and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He also began to develop his own martial arts philosophy, known as Jeet Kune Do, or the Way of the Intercepting Fist. He suffered a serious back injury while training, one that doctors said would prevent him from performing martial arts ever again.
The important point is that the back injury was a turning point in his life, and the result of which was all of those writings he was able to do.
Over a period of 6 months, he made a baffling recovery. Though he would continue to suffer back problems for the rest of his life, he had sculpted one of the most impressive physiques imaginable. Unable to break into Hollywood, Bruce returned to Hong Kong. Already immensely popular in Asia because of his role as Kato, he signed a contract with Golden Harvest Studios for a series of movies. The first, 1971's The Big Boss, elevated him to superstardom. By the time he began work on The Game of Death in 1972, Bruce had evolved not only into a star, but also a producer and director. Bruce halted production on this film when Warner Brothers offered a joint collaboration on a new picture called Enter the Dragon.
Bruce Lee has really transcended this idea of either being a martial artist, a movie star, a philosophical teacher, or even being Chinese. He's sort of become a heroic figure and an icon of righteousness to the world.
After finishing Enter the Dragon, Bruce returned to Hong Kong to pick up The Game of Death. On the night of July 20th, 1973, He was offered a prescription painkiller for a headache. When he could not be woken, he was rushed to a hospital where doctors pronounced him dead. An autopsy revealed excessive swelling of the brain, the result of an adverse reaction to the painkiller.